That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
In recent years, the situation in U.S. agriculture has changed dramatically, and many farmers no longer see a future on their land. This is not just an economic downturn, it is a crisis that has shaken the very foundations of America's food security. Imagine this. Fields that once fed the world are now overgrown with weeds, and instead of harvesting their crops, farmers are taking to the streets with signs and burning their labor. But while America is in crisis, just across the northern border, a country that was once just a neighbor is quietly and confidently filling the void. Who would have thought that Canada, a country with less land and a less developed agricultural history, would take over tens of billions of dollars in contracts that used to belong to the United States? That is exactly what is happening.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Forgotten trust in American agricultural products, high fertilizer costs, a catastrophic decline in the workforce, and most importantly, lagging key technologies are all threatening the future of U.S. agriculture. Canadian farmers are quietly signing contract after contract without resorting to loud statements, simply delivering quality products on time, according to international standards, and with complete transparency. As a result, more and more countries around the world are beginning to favor Canada over the United States, despite the fact that American farmers were once at the forefront of food exports.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
And here's what's happening. Over the past few years, American farmers have lost huge markets, primarily in the Middle East and Asia. But this is only the beginning. Products that were once delivered to Europe, Asia, and South America are now going to neighboring Canada, which ensures timely delivery and quality.
U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
What happened to these markets? Why did the United States' old partners suddenly decide that it was much more profitable to work with Canada? And what will happen to American agriculture now? We will discuss how the American agricultural industry is slowly losing its power and how another player is taking its place on the world stage.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
We will find out how new trade agreements and policy changes have put an end to long-standing traditions and how this will affect each of us. Is the U.S. facing a disaster in agriculture? Can America, one of the leading agricultural countries, regain its leadership? Or is it already too late? What will happen if, in the future, more and more products on our store shelves are labeled "Product of Canada" instead of "Made in the USA"? In this video, we will examine what is behind this change and why farmers, who were once trusted to feed the world, are now struggling to survive.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
American farmers are going through tough times. Agriculture, which was once the heart of the U.S. economy, is now in a state of complete decline. This is not just an economic crisis, it is a systemic problem that threatens food security not only in the US, but around the world. Farmers, who until recently were confident in their role on the global stage, are now on the brink of despair. Protests, abandoned fields, and unprofitable harvests have become part of the reality faced by American agricultural producers.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
One of the main reasons behind this crisis is changes in trade policy. The signing of new agreements and the introduction of tariffs have disrupted old export mechanisms that previously provided a stable income. But this is not just an economic problem. American farmers are facing other challenges that would have seemed impossible for a country once known as a food superpower. One of the most serious factors was the rise in fertilizer and fuel prices. For example, in 2023, the cost of fertilizer rose by 30%, while the price of diesel fuel, which is needed to operate agricultural machinery, increased by 40%. This led farmers to reduce their acreage, and some even abandon agriculture altogether.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Another important problem is the labor shortage. U.S. immigration policy has severely restricted the flow of migrant workers, who make up the bulk of the agricultural workforce. In 2024, about 60% of workers in agricultural markets, including harvesting and animal care, are migrants. With a sharp decline in their numbers, farmers faced a labor shortage, which further increased their costs and reduced efficiency.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
In addition, one of the biggest losses has been the reduction in export contracts. Until recently, the United States was a leading player in the agricultural market, supplying products to Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. However, with the onset of trade wars and changes in foreign policy, the United States has lost several key markets. For example, due to new tariffs and bureaucratic barriers, Middle Eastern countries began to purchase grain and vegetables not from American farmers, but from their neighbors, the Canadians. In 2023, Canada signed a $1 billion 0-cents contract with Egypt to supply wheat, taking this lucrative market away from the U.S. Similar losses were repeated in other countries. leaving farmers without access to profitable export contracts.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe, and then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
What happened to the markets that America once considered its own? The reason lies not only in duties and new tariffs, but also in the fact that Canada has become much more flexible in terms of compliance with quality standards and delivery times. For example, in 2022, Canada modernized its logistics system by introducing high-tech storage facilities for agricultural products, which enabled it to guarantee deliveries on schedule without delaying contracts. American farmers, on the other hand, faced disruptions in the supply chain and poor coordination. In 2024, one of the largest American farming associations published a report stating that losses due to delivery delays amounted to more than $200 million, 0 cents. While Canadians were calmly delivering their products on time, American farmers were facing rising costs and broken contracts. Against the backdrop of this crisis, farmers began to protest. In June 2024, an event took place in Kansas that attracted national attention. In response to the devastation and loss of markets, local farmers organized a mass protest, burning their fields. They were not protesting against the government, but against the system itself, which had left them without support. One farmer, whose family had been growing wheat in Kansas for 4 generations, said he could no longer continue his work. "We can no longer compete with Canada. They deliver quality products on time and at a reasonable price," he said in an interview. This situation became symbolic of how America was losing its position in the agricultural market. What happened to those who did not join the protests but simply continued to work in conditions of economic instability? The answer lies in their growing disappointment. Many farmers, such as the Kansas farmer, suffered not only financial losses but also moral disappointment. When you have cared for the land your entire life, when you sow and reap every year, and then find that your products simply have no buyers, it becomes not only an economic defeat, but also a personal one. And that is when farmers begin to ask questions. Why is this happening? They feel that they are no longer considered important, that their labor is no longer needed, and that deeply undermines faith in the system that once sustained American agriculture. All of these problems, while deeply rooted in economics, also have social consequences. The farmer protests, the abandoned fields, and the destroyed crops are all signs that farmers no longer believe change is possible. Instead of returning to its former prosperity, the United States faces a loss of trust on the international stage. And that trust is not so easy to regain. While other countries, such as Canada, are able to create a more stable and predictable agricultural environment, America stands on the sidelines, unable to return to the global market. The situation with American farmers is not just an economic downturn. It is a loss of the very essence of what once made the country great. It is a loss of faith in a system that once guaranteed stability and prosperity. For many years, American agriculture was synonymous with reliability and quality. However, now, with each passing year, this reputation is slowly but surely disappearing. And no one can say how long American farmers will be able to withstand this crisis. When we talk about the reasons for the decline in U.S. competitiveness in the agricultural sector, we cannot fail to mention several key factors that have been decisive in the loss of position on the international stage. This process was not instantaneous. It has been developing for several years, and now we are seeing its dire results. American farmers have faced a multitude of problems, each of which could have caused a crisis on its own. But together, they have created a catastrophic situation for the country's agriculture. The first serious problem is that America can no longer offer the guarantees of quality and stability that international buyers expect. In a world where competition in agricultural markets is growing and product quality requirements are becoming increasingly stringent, the United States has found itself unprepared for change. The certification and quality control system in the US is outdated, and instead of introducing new standards, farmers face bureaucratic barriers and insufficient support from the authorities. A simple example: in 2023, when one of China's largest importers rejected a shipment of soybeans from Iowa, the reason was not the product itself, but the inability to trace its origin with sufficient accuracy. Chinese buyers insisted on a system that would allow them to track every stage from field to table, including pesticide use, drying and storage methods, and accurate delivery data. This situation became one of the key moments that showed that the American agricultural industry cannot offer the level of transparency that modern markets require. Canada, on the other hand, was ready to meet these challenges. Canada invested in the development of its agricultural infrastructure, including the introduction of a QR code system for product tracking, which became mandatory for all meat and grain shipments in 2024. This system has enabled Canadian farmers to easily meet the requirements of Chinese and Japanese buyers and increase confidence in their products. Unlike the United States, which has faced numerous internal disputes between the federal government and local authorities, Canadians have focused on creating a unified certification system that has been recognized by international organizations. Today, Canada is considered one of the most reliable suppliers of agricultural products on the global market. But what is happening in America? Unfortunately, the United States cannot compete with Canada in terms of innovation. While Canada is investing in new technologies and standards, the US continues to cling to an outdated subsidy system that does not meet modern requirements. In 2023, the US administration significantly reduced funding for farmers, leading to a sharp decline in production in some states. In Iowa, for example, farmers who were used to working under the old system were suddenly faced with cuts to the subsidies they had been receiving for decades. The situation got so bad that several large farms in the state were forced to close, and their owners sold their land for next to nothing. At the same time, Canadian farmers not only continued to receive support, but also began to receive tax breaks, which allowed them to remain competitive in the market. In addition, it is important to note that America's problem is not only aging infrastructure, but also the rising cost of agricultural production. In recent years, the cost of fuel, fertilizers, seeds, and equipment has increased significantly. The cost of fertilizers rose by 35% in 2024, while diesel fuel became 40% more expensive. These factors made American agriculture less profitable than its competitors. In Canada, thanks to its developed infrastructure and innovation, production costs were 20% lower than in the United States, giving Canada a competitive advantage. So how did Canadian farmers manage to replace American farmers so easily on the world market? The answer is simple: stability and reliability. Canadians managed to build an agricultural system that met all international standards. While the US tried to weaken the market through subsidies and internal disputes, Canada simply continued to develop its contracts. In 2024, Canada signed a $1 billion zero-cents contract to supply wheat to Egypt, taking the deal away from the US. While America struggled with rising prices and subsidy cuts, Canada quietly signed long-term contracts and delivered on time. It is impossible not to mention another important issue that has negatively affected the US agricultural sector: labor migration. In recent years, the tightening of immigration laws in the US has made it impossible to attract cheap labor, which used to be employed in harvesting. In 2023, farmers in California, Washington, and Oregon faced labor shortages, resulting in significant crop losses. As a result, for example, 40% of the cherry crop in Washington was left on the trees, and many vegetables simply rotted in the fields in California. At the same time, Canadian farmers, despite similar challenges, organized programs to attract and train seasonal workers, ensuring a steady flow of labor to their fields. Thus, the United States is losing out to Canada not only in terms of production, but also in terms of infrastructure, technology, and government support. Declining confidence in American agricultural products, contract violations, and high costs have led farmers facing growing difficulties to increasingly turn to the government with demands for reform.